The grand ballroom shimmered in gold and ivory, every corner draped in elegance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting the glow of hundreds of candles. Guests in luxurious gowns and tailored suits murmured in admiration, their attention fixed on the stunning bride, Vanessa Harper, the millionaire's wife. Her smile glimmered, but her eyes carried a quiet sharpness, the kind that drew respect and fear. Beside her stood David Harper, a composed and charming businessman whose calm demeanor hid years of restraint. The night was meant to celebrate love and wealth, but beneath the glitter, tensions simmered. Among the servers moving silently through the crowd was a young woman, Grace, 24, visibly pregnant, wearing a neatly pressed maid's uniform. Her soft brown eyes held a mixture of humility and exhaustion. Every step she took was careful, her hand resting occasionally on her belly as she balanced trays of champagne. Grace had been working for the Harpers for nearly 2 years, ever since she lost her husband in a construction accident. For her, this job meant survival. But tonight, she could feel the heavy gaze of Vanessa following her every move. The orchestra began playing a soft tune as guests turned toward the dance floor. Vanessa, in her diamond-lace gown, whispered something to a waiter and smirked. Moments later, the music stopped and Vanessa stood with a microphone in hand. "Before we continue," she announced sweetly, "I think it would be lovely to hear a song from someone very close to our hearts. Grace, darling, come up here." The room fell silent. Grace froze where she stood, her hands trembling. She wasn't a performer. She was a maid. Grace looked around, her heart racing. The guests stared with confusion, whispering. Vanessa's tone was polite, but her smirk made it clear this was not a kind invitation. David turned toward his wife, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing yet. Grace slowly stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. The stage lights felt blinding and the baby inside her kicked as if sensing her fear. She clasped her hands, bowing slightly. "Mrs. Harper, I can't sing," she whispered nervously. The microphone picked up her trembling voice. Vanessa laughed lightly, waving a hand. "Nonsense, you used to hum while cleaning the nursery. I remember how heartfelt it sounded." The tone of mockery was unmistakable. The guests looked uneasy, some glancing at David for his reaction. He stared at Grace, his eyes softening. Something about her frightened, gentle face stirred something inside him, guilt, anger, compassion. Vanessa crossed her arms and said coldly, "Go on, Grace, sing for us." The command echoed across the hall. With nowhere to escape, Grace took a deep breath. Her voice, though trembling at first, floated through the air, soft, pure, and filled with emotion. The room grew still. Her song spoke of loss, hope, and forgiveness, words that struck deeper than any expensive performance could. Even the guests who had been smirking now listened in silence, their expressions changing. Vanessa's smile began to fade. Grace's voice carried pain, but it was beautiful, painfully honest. When she finished, no one clapped. They were too stunned. David stood slowly, his eyes glistening with something unspoken. He walked toward Grace, ignoring the murmurs. Vanessa's face hardened, her nails digging into her palm. "That's enough, David," she hissed under her breath. But he didn't stop. Standing before Grace, he gently took the microphone from her shaking hands and turned to the guests. "You've all just heard one of the most beautiful voices I've ever known," he said, his voice firm. "But what you don't know is the cruelty behind why she was made to sing." A wave of whispers spread through the hall. Vanessa's expression turned pale as David continued. "Grace has been working tirelessly in our home while carrying her child, never complaining, never asking for more, and tonight, instead of being respected, she was humiliated for entertainment." His tone sharpened. "This is not the kind of household I wish to represent." The crowd went silent, all eyes shifting to Vanessa, whose confident facade cracked. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Sir, please, you don't have to," but David shook his head gently. "No, Grace, you deserve better." He turned back to the audience. "From this day forward, she will no longer serve in our house as a maid. She'll be under my personal sponsorship with full pay leave until her child is born." Gasps filled the hall. The announcement felt like thunder rolling through marble walls. Vanessa's fury ignited. "David, you're humiliating me in front of everyone," she snapped, stepping forward. "She's just a servant." The crowd recoiled at her words. David's calm broke, his voice rose. "No, Vanessa, she's a human being, something you seem to have forgotten in your obsession with status." The silence that followed was heavy. Guests exchanged nervous glances as the once perfect image of the Harpers shattered in front of them. Vanessa turned to storm away, but the press and guests had already captured every word, every expression. The whispers turned into judgmental stares. Grace stood frozen, overwhelmed, her hands trembling over her belly. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his tone softening. "You did nothing wrong. Tonight you reminded everyone what real Grace looks like." The irony of her name struck him, and for the first time in years he smiled sincerely. The wedding night ended in chaos. Vanessa locked herself in the bridal suite, her anger echoing through the halls. Guests slowly left, whispering about how the millionaire defended a maid over his own wife. But to David, the humiliation didn't matter, only truth did. Grace, escorted by an assistant, sat quietly in the garden afterward, gazing at the moonlit fountain. She still couldn't believe what had happened. A few weeks later, the media caught wind of the event. Headlines spread across business and gossip columns. "Millionaire defends pregnant maid at his own wedding." Opinions were divided, but the public loved the story. Grace was offered help from charities and even a scholarship program. Vanessa filed for separation, but David didn't fight it. He had seen her cruelty for too long, and this was his breaking point. Months passed. Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy. David visited her at the hospital with flowers and a smile. "You saved me from a life of pretension," he told her softly. "You reminded me that kindness matters more than reputation." Grace smiled shyly, whispering her thanks. Life had changed not just for her but for him too. She had shown him the strength of humility and forgiveness. Years later, a news feature showed Grace running her own foundation for single mothers, fully funded by David Harper. The two remained close friends. Their bond built on compassion born from humiliation. The world had moved on, but the story of that night, when a millionaire's wife forced a pregnant maid to sing and the husband chose empathy over pride, remained unforgettable. It wasn't just about wealth or power anymore. It was about humanity rediscovered in the most unexpected moment. Years later, the story of that wedding night still echoed like a quiet legend, told in boardrooms, whispered in charity halls, and remembered by those who had seen the moment unfold with their own eyes. David Harper had become known not just as a successful millionaire, but as a man who chose conscience over vanity. His companies began funding ethical programs, focusing on women's welfare and fair treatment of workers. Grace, now radiant and confident, often stood beside him at events not as an employee but as a respected partner in kindness. Her child, a bright boy with curious eyes, sometimes held David's hand, unaware that his mother's courage had once changed a man's heart forever. As the camera lights flashed and the applause rose, both of them knew it wasn't a fairy tale ending, but something far more real. A redemption story written in humility, compassion, and the quiet power of standing up for what's right. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline as Grace stepped out of the community center, her hand resting gently on her growing son's shoulder. Sounds of laughter and music from the children's event echoed behind them, a celebration she had organized for families who once struggled like she had. Across the street, David stood quietly beside his car, watching her with a proud, almost wistful smile. He no longer carried the arrogance of a man who once thought money could measure worth. Instead, his eyes held warmth, shaped by gratitude and change. When Grace approached, he handed her a small white envelope, a scholarship fund in her son's name. "For his dreams," he said simply. She smiled, eyes glistening under the evening glow. "For all of ours," she whispered back. The moment felt complete, no spotlight, no crowd, just two people bound by an unforgettable night that had reshaped both their lives. And as they parted ways beneath the golden streetlight, the city seemed to breathe a little softer, as if forgiveness itself had finally found a home. A soft piano melody played in the background as the camera panned over a quiet evening by the lake. Grace and her son sat on a wooden bench, tossing small pebbles into the rippling water. The boy laughed, his reflection shimmering beside hers, the sound pure, full of life and hope. In the distance, David stood with his hands in his pockets, watching them from afar. He didn't approach this time, he didn't need to. The peace in their faces was enough. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of roses, the same kind that once decorated that fateful wedding night, and Grace smiled, realizing how far she had come from being the frightened maid who was forced to sing. The world had tried to humiliate her, but fate had written a different ending. Now, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the music swelled softly, the screen faded to black, leaving only her voice in the air, whispering words of strength. Dignity can't be bought, it can only be lived. Years later, people still spoke of that wedding, not because of its luxury or grandeur, but because of what it revealed about true character. The story became a quiet legend shared across the city, a reminder that humility and humanity could shine even in the most opulent of places. Grace had built a foundation that helped women in service jobs find protection, education, and dignity. Her face often appeared on posters, not as a symbol of pity, but of strength. She never sought fame, only fairness. Meanwhile, David continued his work quietly, turning his wealth toward causes that mattered, building schools, shelters, and small hospitals in the very neighborhoods he once overlooked. Sometimes at charity galas, their eyes met across a room full of flashing lights and polite applause, and a simple nod between them said everything. They didn't need to speak. Both knew they had rewritten the ending that life had once cruelly planned for them. The same world that once humiliated a maid now celebrated her courage, and in that silent acknowledgement, both found peace that neither power nor money could ever buy.